All right, for those of you who are newer to listening to the Redacted Culture Cast, I'm doing something a little bit differently. I am, while recording this, which is supposed to go live or supposed to be released on Monday of the following week, I've also got it going live on the good old Instagram. So that's a tool as much as it is a torture device that has to do with communication. So this episode is also a little bit, well, it's quite unscripted. I have been away from the camera. I've been away from the desk for a while, and I've been away from what feels like the greater world as well. And in that time away, quite a bit has gone on. But this episode is directed towards one common theme that I'm observing rolling across particularly the Western world, and once again, in another example, the microcosm of gun culture. So, without further ado, the last 6 months of our life, and this is June 28th, this is being recorded on June 28th, 2025. But the last 6 months of life in particularly America have been a bit of a roller coaster. It was about 6 months ago when Donald Trump won the election. That would have been November of last year. And immediately following that election, there was this wave of relief that washed across the country. See, the biblical proverb of when the wicked rule, the people suffer, was certainly reflected in the presidency and reign of one Joe Biden. Two, who will most likely go down in history as a forgotten president, but if he does remain any noteworthy elements, it will probably be that of human trafficking and pedophilia, as his administration participated in the trafficking of people across the southern border, and his open and flagrant worship of the LGBTQ religion must have had to get its hands on the kiddos. So, leaving that element of politics aside, over the last couple months, particularly in this time that I was away, but also in observation of things going on in the world, there has been this bit of pessimism particularly washing over our culture as well. That pessimism is strange but pointed. At the same time that you saw a quote-unquote division amongst the American Republicans, or the completely not real, the fake breakup of the relationship between Donald Trump and Elon Musk, there has been this shocking anger that it's not working, this almost expectation that the shoe is falling off the other foot and it's all coming crashing down. The hopes and dreams of the great savior of Donald Trump, which is, if you know, sarcasm, is not working the way that we all expected to, particularly then in the further fractioning and conflict over Israel, America, and Iran. But then at the same time that this is going on, we've watched many heroes within the gun culture, many pillars of the last 10 years sort of fall into elements of disgrace, whether it's as chaotic and large as someone like Tim Kennedy, or as interpersonal and familial grieving like someone like Lucas Botkin. And T-Rex Arms. And then there are other names to go down that we could create a drama channel off alone with all the things going wrong. But that is not the point. The point is that I think some of this pessimism is artificial and manufactured, but also I think it points out a principle, which is that what we are in as far as a world, the world that we live in, is not one that can be solved merely by ideas. In part of my absence, I was away on a road trip, and I like to listen to books while I'm on the road. And instead of starting something new, I went through a lot of Atlas Shrugged again, because it's not that I think it is a particularly seminal work. It's just sort of like that. It's like that comfort food of a story. And in driving, you see a lot of this reliance on ideas in the book, but there's also something else going on. Now, before I get any further, I want to make two announcements or two statements. One of them is that on July 19th, I will be doing a public land cleanup with none other than Narco, All Skill No Luck. Tour might be out there in the San Diego area. It's not yet, well, at the time of recording, it should be, the information and details should be available on the website. But just so you know, we are doing a public land cleanup in California again. The second thing that I want to, or that needs to get addressed, is that this episode is sponsored by Obsidian Arms. Now, before you scroll on past the show or you skip ahead, a personal note, those who are closer to me know that I have a reputation of providing additional wear and tear on my equipment. Not that I'm doing it merely for aesthetic. In fact, I do remember a time where I waited a long time to get a specific lower, and when it came in, I had some sort of issue with it, and instead of waiting patiently and getting the right tool for the right job, I ended up providing a cosmetic damage to it, which ultimately then created a performance issue, which cost me a ranking in a competition. Now, the way to get around that is having the right tool for the job, and Obsidian Arms is the sponsor of this show, and they offer a series of punch-in toolkits that come with a lifetime warranty. And to make it as simple as it can be, having the right tool for the right job will save you aches and pains for years to come. And they are simple and affordable. If you use the code below, well, if you're watching on Instagram, that's not going to work. But if you use the code below, you can find their equipment at obsidianarms.com. To recap where we're coming at here is that in the last 6 months, there was a wave of optimism that crossed the country, particularly with the election of Donald Trump. But there were other things at hand that were working their way through perhaps the courts. We've seen that FRTs, or forced reset triggers, are now bona fide legal according to the ATF. We know they're going to change their mind again as soon as they get the chance, but there's also something like the Short Act and the Hearing Protection Act that are supposedly trying to get mixed into this big, beautiful bill that Donald Trump is announcing, and parliamentarians and random bureaucrats can't help but get in the way of progress. And the pessimism that I want to address, specifically the pessimism that's frustrating me, is that there comes a time that, like we're witnessing now, where you can see that the measure of a person's hope is shorter than the measure of their courage. And what I mean by courage is that, trust me when I say this, the rest of our life is going to have challenges. See, I was born in the 90s, and while I appreciate the idea of this so-called making America great again, we have to recognize that it's a slogan, and that slogan is not that somebody else is going to do the work. See, if you want to have improvement in your own life and you are unwilling to participate in said improvement, then don't be surprised when the things do not come to pass that you are looking for. But it's a little bit more important here, in more specific, perhaps a little bit more personal on this note, because as I have kind of engaged in some of the intellectual life, I've had to come to realize in a very painful way often that having the right answer is not sufficient for getting the right outcome. See, it's not always an object of knowledge, but sometimes has to do with action as well. And of course, we can get into the pedantic argument of mind over matter and heart over intelligence. And ultimately, if you're going to get to the end of it, you know you need to have all the things. You need to focus on the mind, build that up when you can. You need to focus on the body. If you don't focus, if you leave your body to rot, but you have all the right ideas, it doesn't work. And where this is coming at, especially in the modern political zeitgeist, is that with the election of Donald Trump, there was this. There was a bona fide, genuine relief. There was this moment that, hey, maybe the insanity is going to kind of ride itself out. Maybe we've gotten to the end of what is the hard times. But, and I'll tell you this, going back to someone who was born in the 90s, two things have persisted my entire life. One of them is depression, which might be personal. The second one, however, is a little bit more nefarious, and that is that this idea of hard times create strong men create good times create, weak men, and weak men create hard times. This methodology, this mentality that the bad thing is about to happen has persisted my entire life. Year after year, day after day, gun culture, well, at that time you might call them something else, but marketing majors have relied on the idea, whether in politics or in guns, that if I tell you that the apocalypse is about to happen, you are more likely to buy my product. And it doesn't mean, and it's not going to say that there isn't a great value in the idea of preparedness. If you have security in your home because you have water stored up, food set aside, material in other regarding your security and transportation. Oh, there's a cracking of my voice. If you have all of this set aside, then you are more free in a time of tight limits to do more good. The problem that I have with this idea and this mentality, which trust me, as I'm building the full circle all the way to come back around, is that it relies on a timeline that I will do the right thing only after the apocalypse has happened. This great fatalistic pessimism of the American gun culture, the fatalistic, it's all going to hell kind of mentality suddenly evaporated a little bit in the election of Donald Trump, and there was this sense of optimism that maybe the Hearing Protection Act will make it through Congress. Note, Hearing Protection Act having to do with the opening up and the reducing of restrictions on suppressors, and the Short Act, or something similar under that name, removing the completely arbitrary and mentally idiotic concept of a short-barreled rifle as something that needs to be, managed, tracked, whatever by the ATF. Of course, the idea of being progressive, and I'll dive into the politics real quick. The idea of progressive is you're only allowed to progress in the most stupid way possible. Because if we understood the progression of people's violence and participation in said violence, we would recognize that the distinction between a 14-inch and a 16-inch barrel on an AR-15 is completely meaningless in the 21st century. But alas, bureaucrats are never willing to let their grubby hands off of your money, and here we are. But getting back to the point, because I was talking about this idea of American pessimism, that there's this fatalistic idea that the hard times are about to be here, and I will argue that in many cases, the hard times are where we are now, that the hard times are not about to come, we are in them now, because we live in a time of insanity. The statistic of male suicide being so high should not be considered a warning of the hard times, but evidence that we are experiencing it. And this idea, this perpetual idea that, of kind of like cultural depression, as well as that the great big bad event is about to take place, is a symptom of what I think is the problem. And that is that it is always somebody else's responsibility until I have the utmost level of compromise available. And what I mean by that, and let me diagnose, or let me digress, is that the problem with this idea of perpetual apocalypticism is that it remains on a moral framework which suggests that the individual doesn't have to do anything until the collapse, that you don't need to rebuild society until it has completely fallen apart, or that there needs to be some sort of great reset in order to sort of turn the computer off and turn it back on again. Instead, though, and why this is always an issue for me, is it forgoes the individual responsibility of the individual today. See, if you want your children to grow up in a better world than you are, you probably don't want it to fall apart. It doesn't mean that we need to maintain all the levels of corruption and all the problems and all the foundational aspects that have created some of these issues to begin with, but if we want our children to grow up in a better world than that we do now, why are you relying on some sort of apocalypse to set the stage for which you're going to now rebuild the world in your own ideals? We live in America. The idea of warfare is perpetual. You will not get away from living a life of either responsibility or abdication. That is all. And so the criticism of this apocalypticism is now going to be applied to the pessimism that we are facing both within the gun culture and within America as a whole, as we are seeing things like Donald Trump engage in warlike activities with Iran. Certainly, there was an opportunity for the ops, so to speak, the opposition, to find cracks in the marble surface or the loose confederation, I guess that might be one way of saying it, but the loose collection of people that make up the right. And if we are going to take on the mentality of someone like Tim Pool, that the left is a monoculture and the right is a disparate group of collected peoples with differing ideas except for some shared ideals, well, then we would have to understand that there are sort of independence or individuality is going to be used against us. And one way where that happened very critically was in the military actions involving Iran. However, as much as I believed people were admired Donald Trump's position in his in his his second presidential campaign, was that he was a president who didn't start any new wars. They took that as the assumption that no military conflict would ever come to pass again under Donald Trump, which is a problem because it illustrates a fundamental misunderstanding of how warfare functions in the 21st century. The boomer and the American boomer specifically is still caught in a paradigm that died 70 years ago before they were even alive. It probably is closer to 80 now. And that paradigm that died was the end of conventional warfare. As much as Karl von Clausewitz began at the end of the Napoleonic era, the atom bomb ended that paradigm completely, where warfare was conflict between belligerent governments using uniformed soldiers that had a distinction between the combatant and the non-combatant. If that is your framework for warfare, you are obsolete in the contemporary world. But that leaves us open up for an entire new problem. And that is that, well, if the strict conformity to a prior existing paradigm is no longer accessible, then cannot everything and anything be considered warfare? And therein lies the problem. It's not that everything and anything can and will be understood as and used in a form of warfare. But, however, it is no longer specifically governments alone that are the target. And if we are going to fall into a pit, an intellectual pit here, we would turn modern warfare into a monomania, that everything and anything that exists or happens in the world or in our environment has to be viewed in the lens of some type of warfare. And I think that would be wrong. However, going back to the conflict between Israel and Iran, America and Iran, and this whole negotiating, fighting, bombing problem, is that if you think that the world will ever exist in a day of peace between now and the end of time, or the end of any form of globalization, you frightfully need to understand where we are at in the world. See, a terror cell, which is a non-government organization, can now fund a different form, let's say, of terror, and then in going to the extent of informing them, arming them, and sending them in a direction in order to meet their own ends while disguising themselves as said responsibility. Now, I will use this as an example in conversations. I've used it before, and that is that a number of months ago, there was an attack on a factory in England, in the UK, and it was two young kids who were had an opportunity to spray glue into a machine, if I recall this correctly, effectively gumming up the works. And what that caused is a delay in manufacturing. And what the facility was manufacturing was munitions, particularly those being used in the Israel-Gaza conflict. Now, when arrested, the kids said that they were doing their, let's call it terrorism, on behalf of Greenpeace, that they wanted to stop the military-industrial complex. But now, this is the important part, happens then when the proxy, the proxy of the activist group, is funded not by a government, but by a terror cell. In other words, how did those kids know that was the factory, determine that they were able to, reconnoiter it and effectively gum up the machine? Why was that factory targeted and not another one? And it raises the question of why or what warfare looks like now. And that is that we have, due to globalization, conflict is going to unfortunately be perpetual until we get a cyberpunk dystopia with one world government, which then will be its own nightmare beyond human comprehension. That being the case, the idea that Donald Trump was going back on his idea of, well, I will be a president that starts no new wars, is a frightful, again, boomerism of this idea of warfare. If we are going to be legally correct, the last war that America was in was World War II, but now we have these military conflicts like the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, the GWOT, the Global War on Terror, the War on Drugs, and this language of war is perpetually finding itself in our milieu and in our vernacular. And I think that it's gotten so muddy that it doesn't stick. But this has to do with Donald Trump. And Donald Trump engaging in a military action against Iran caused a lot of people to suddenly become pessimistic that, oh no, our one chance at a good president turned out to be a failure. And I think it illustrates two key principles here. One is that under a moment of, let's say, pessimism, weaknesses were illustrated in the American Conservative Party, such as that the perception of war was enough to break the will of individuals. The second thing is the failure of hero worship, and that is that the idea, I think people who saw that Donald Trump was going to be the savior of the United States were faced with a certain dilemma, especially in the event that he said he was not going to go engage in warfare, and yet he did. And this is kind of where I want to narrow it down into the point and kind of closing it off and tying this all together. The idea specifically that we have these things stacked up with each other, whether it's the pessimism and like, oh no, the Short Act isn't going to work and we're going to quit and throw up our hands and run out the door and say, oh no, they've removed the language of the Hearing Protection Act from the big beautiful bill. Let's throw up our hands and quit and throw in the towel and lose our heads. It illustrates this lack of courage and not intelligence in our midst. And I'm not seeing this to be in a man in a glass house throwing stones, but rather recognizing not only in my own self, but in us as a community, if we are going to call to virtue, if we're going to call to and point towards some sort of set of values, but let those values fall away when we are under duress or the thing that we put our hope in did not follow through, then we are frighteningly revealing how low our bar is for success. And that's a very, very wordy way of saying, now is the time for courage to face the challenges that we are looking at and to stand behind the values that we claim to hold. Now is not the time to analyze the depths of loyalty to Donald Trump that we're talking about. And I'm not even arguing about him specifically. I'm saying that we are seeing people who, for a brief moment, were given a respite from suffering, immediately became frail, and at the slightest sign that it wasn't going to follow through, caved under pressure and gave in to pessimism. And that and that is the challenge that I want to call to attention. If your courage is so small that it caves under the first sign of pressure, don't get me wrong, don't get me wrong, it has been a rough 30 years for the gun culture. It has been a rough 50 years for the Americans. But if we're going to cave under the smallest perception that the false heroes that we put our hope in are not going to live up to the standards that we knew they were never going to reach to begin with, then we are the fools and not them. We are the people who are putting ourselves in harm's way, up to jeopardy, when we are claiming a set of virtues, but bailing on them and choosing to go back to pessimism at the slightest sign of conflict. So, what does that mean? What does that mean going forward? It means that right now we are in a pivotal moment where the Hush Act and the Short Act might make their way through Congress. But even if they do, we have something to be thankful for. If they don't at this time, we have something to aim at. We as the gun culture have something to aim at until that is achieved. That hope and that pursuit does not erase or erode or overlook other individual pursuits that we have, whether that is skill development, character development, family provision, and so forth. But it is not a time to just say, oh, Thomas Massey didn't say the words that I wanted him to say, so we throw in the towel and we say all politicians are corrupt, and that's all you have. We know that politicians are corrupt. We know that the government is not going to be efficient. We know that the people who are opposed to the individual ownership of guns and firearms are not intelligent enough to understand the tools that they are dealing with and use government like magic spells to try to force everyone to give them what they want. We know these things. But if we quit, if we throw up the towel, if we give in to infighting, if we choose pessimism over duty, responsibility, and courage, then we are to blame, not our whatever you want to call them. Oppressors is such a communist word and I don't want to use it. But if we are going to say that we are going to throw in the towel and give in to pessimism this early in the game, I'm only in my 30s. If we're going to throw in the towel this early in the game, then it is us who are to blame, not the fools in government, not the fools over there, not the gun culture, which we can't put all of our hope in, but we want to put some of our identity in, blah, 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 blah. If we are fools enough to place our hope on things that cannot fulfill them, and instead and use that as an excuse not to pursue the fulfillment and the explanation or the fulfillment and the participation of the values that we hold, then we ourselves are to blame for the failure to reach the height that we were supposed to be aiming at to begin with. And so that is the conclusion. It's not just about intelligence. It's not about getting the right answer. It's about courage. And if we are going to give in to pessimism now, we do not get to blame others for our own individual refusal to dig deep inside, grab onto that courage, and go forth and conquer. So this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. That has been the motto of this production for some time now, and it goes back to saying that. It is not just a phrase that we hold. It cannot be just the game of status quo. If you want to support the channel, you know where to find us, but of all things, in all the ways that we are going forward, do not give in to pessimism. Instead, go forth and conquer.